Minister, this motion seeks that government would scrap plans to increase the price of petrol and diesel on the 1st of August and yet again on the 9th of October, but also to reverse the increase that took place on the 1st of April. The main rationale to the motion is to recognise that fuel prices have risen by more than 30% in the past 3 years, and to recognise also the significant and pronounced negative effect this is having on the general cost of living and hard-pressed families that are caught in the grips of these rises. Much of the rationale around raising excise duties of fossil fuels is firstly to raise revenue, to try to provide for carbon mitigation and just transition, but also to force behavioural change in terms of consumption patterns of fossil fuels where this is possible. And this, Minister, is the kicker, where this is possible. For many of our most vulnerable, the impact of the rising prices is not something they can offset. They cannot afford new heating systems. They cannot afford retrofitting of houses. They cannot afford installation of solar. They cannot access cheap wind power. They cannot change their inefficient, fuel-guzzling transportation to electric, for example. And neither can they significantly expand their income generation, given many of the social and economic barriers they face. I, like many others in this House, can understand the government's desire to meaningfully plan for a transition from fossil fuels, and in doing so, requiring increased levies to both create new income streams, but also to force behavioural change. And it is true that in general society, some behavioural change is becoming more apparent. The move to public transport in the large urban centres, if a viable alternative exists or is provided. Certainly replacing fossil fuel cars with electric. Yes, replacing old kerosene oil boilers for new electric heat pumps. And increasing home insulation. But for some households, and indeed for a great many, the options to reduce costs, to reduce consumption, are just not there. For many households, even where possible, substitutions are possible, they cannot be entered into because in many cases we don't have the manpower to carry them out. And yet the ironic thing too, particularly in terms of motor car transport, it is those who can least afford the excise increases who bear the brunt of these cost increases. Why? Well, because an older car is much more fuel inefficient. It's also because of the longer commutes many of the people who are driving these cars face, because they cannot live in the more affluent, closer parts of urban society. And also older cars require more maintenance and have greater wear out due to component breakdown. The major backdrop to all of this is the cost of energy and the possible substitutions that government are supposed to be working on. The carbon tax, when first mooted, was to fund increased wind and solar energy generation, which would help to mitigate international supply costs. This, Minister, has been happening at a snail's pace, and indeed a significant portion of the carbon tax now is being used as a solidarity support to support the cost of living expenses and inflation, rather than in targeted rollout of carbon mitigation technologies. What is most important is that government presents a new credible plan, in my opinion, in the future, clearly outlining what major milestones are possible in terms of renewable energy generation over the remaining life of this government. There are many in society who would be prepared to pay that price if they could see value in the policy and in the rollout. But this is not happening to date, in my opinion. And Minister, if I could highlight just two areas to you. One is the area of retrofitting, and I'm sure you're quite aware where the costs of retrofitting have gone, and despite the talk of government-supported grants and all the rest of it, it is not feasible now for a great many people to engage in retrofitting their houses. And again, pardon? Well, even if you did, Minister, I can tell you from people I'm talking to, Minister, I'm down in Waterford, I can tell you I've seen very few houses retrofitted. I've seen very few people engaging in a retrofitting scheme, and everybody tells me they have looked at it, it's not affordable for them. Regardless whether you might think it's affordable, I can tell you for the people I'm speaking about, it's not. That's the one thing. The second thing I would say to you is HVO deployment. which is not really happening around the country to any great extent. And again, here is some way of mitigating cost of fuels. And beyond that also, Minister, I would say to you that we spoke before, many times people have raised in this House the issue of farm solar. And every farm in this country has some kind of a round top or a flat top hay barn. And we're expecting farmers to step in all the time to provide that solar array. And the question is, why would the state not do that in a far greater way? Surely this is one of the ways that we could significantly mitigate the amount of electricity generation, or the amount of energy that we are buying in versus electricity that we could generate. And I think, Minister, as I said, this is one of the things that should be looked at in the remaining time of government in terms of the carbon tax, exactly how we are spending it, what value for money we are getting, and how we are deploying it.